And go. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started real quick. Good evening and welcome to the Arundel Camera Club meeting for Thursday, October 19th. My name is John Milliker and I'm the club president for the 2023-2024 season. The Arundel Camera Club was founded in 1957 and exists to promote the art, science, and education in all aspects and fields of photography. For more information about us please visit arundelcameraclub.org. We are having some internet issues. It's very windy here, so if for some reason you can't follow along live, we will be putting a recorded version on our YouTube page either later tonight or in the morning. Before we move to tonight's program, do we have any announcements from any of our officers? No? Yes, sir. Yes, Ed.
Well,
come on up and talk to us.
we are so happy to have Ryan give a talk on Monday night. And I have a little invitation for everybody. And it's also going to be on Zoom. So everybody should attend this meeting or be on Zoom because it's going to be spectacular. Probably not as good as tonight, but almost. And then, of course, on Saturday night, we have our thing at the fireman's place where we're going to see the lanterns and everything up in Timonium. So anyway, thank you for your kind attention, and I'll be passing these out.
Okay. Trying to figure out how to get the camera over there on Ed. I'll have to show Christine how to do that. Let me go ahead and move over to Christine, our programs chair, to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Good evening. Did we go over the schedule for the coming up?
No, that is your job.
Next week on October 21st, actually the Saturday on October 21st is our field trip to the Fire Museum that Ed was talking about. On October 26th is our contest, Color and Monochrome Prints, the theme of flowers. On November 2nd is Matthew Hansen doing a program on food photography. And then on November 9th is our digital contest for November with the theme of open. November 16th, Fred Venetia is doing a program on portrait photography. And on November 18th is our field trip to Conowingo Dam. And as a reminder, November 23rd, which is Thanksgiving, of course, there is no meeting. I want to tonight to introduce one of our newer club members, Ryan. He is a photographer and naturalist from Southwest Pennsylvania who has for the last 10 years focused on photographing caves throughout the United States and brings stories of the underground world to light. He went to West Virginia University with degrees in aerospace and mechanical engineering and now works as a software developer for Madeira Software. Sorry. So I'm going to turn over tonight's program to Ryan. Come on up. You have your mic.
Try one more.
Can you hear me good?
Yes.
All right. Can we turn off the lights that are right here? Some of these photos are on the darker side. Yeah, there you go. That way you don't have to see my face as much either. So, as Christine's introduction said, my name is Ryan. I'm just repeating that because I think I haven't met some of you. I am relatively new here. You guys are going to be the first group of non-cavers that I have given a presentation to about cave photography, which made this a bit of a challenge to figure out how to give this to a group of other photographers. Cave photography is, to say it's a niche, what I think would be a bit too cliche on it, that doesn't quite cover it. It's both very narrow and extremely broad. It covers a whole wide array of different types of photographic styles. There's a lot of technical aspects to it. There's a lot of subjective aspects to it. You deal with people, you deal with logistics, you deal with shooting portraits, you deal with shooting macros, you deal with shooting technical stuff. You deal with that frequently at the same time. And you're doing it under fairly difficult conditions. So for people that are watching remotely, I know there were a number of caver friends of mine that wanted to watch this. They get to see me try to explain to a group of people who have no idea what caves are like, what caving is, and to do it in a way that is, we'll say, family friendly. Because cavers are a very interesting and eclectic group of people, and it can be very difficult to describe them to polite society sometimes, we'll say. So, as I move into this, next slide. One of the things that I would like to do is to... That's not the next slide.
Where's his beer?
His beer's outside, but that's not the next slide.
I have that for one, that for two.
No, there's a few slides in the middle there. All right, so the slide that is not currently being shown.
Let me bring up PowerPoint, maybe.
Okay.
And I can share that screen.
All right.
You might want to scoot over a little bit. You're like currently kind of in.
Am I in front of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what they.
So the slide that is currently not being shown is one of the few slides that is mostly text. It is a special thanks to a number of organizations that I've worked with over the last 10 years. So those organizations run the gamut from commercial cave operations to federal agencies, state agencies, international agencies, you name it. And this is an incomplete list that's also been cut off at the bottom. So for those who are wondering, the one that's been cut off is XTR, which is short for Extreme Repels. They're a group of people that facilitate very long rope, rappel, and climbing activities. We were with them at Whiteside Mountain in North Carolina 2 weeks ago doing a 700-foot rappel off the side of that mountain in anticipation of going to Bridge Day in 2 days. Next slide. But this was the one that I really wanted to share because what I do, I am the point person for it, but I am not the only person that makes this happen. Over the last 10 years, I have worked with, this is a minority of the people that I have worked with. I do not have names for everybody. And everybody that you see here, none of them have done it for pay. None of them have done it for personal gain. None of them have done it for any reason other than we're all cavers and this is what we do. And sometimes I can convince some of them to sit still long enough to pose for a picture. So this is actually a bit old, this slide, but as you can see, there's just everybody that you see in these pictures, they've all done this willingly, I promise. They've also have all done it of their own accord and desire. So next slide. So part of the reason, one of the things I want to start out with is what is caving like? Why do we do it? And why take pictures of them? So as you're probably aware, caves are these open spaces underground. Sometimes they have daylight in parts of them, like entrances such as this one. Sometimes they don't. Frequently they don't once you get away from it. And then once you get away from an entrance, you're working in complete and total darkness. There's more light in a dark room. I'm not quite sure how to, I considered starting this off with an exercise. I was gonna ask everybody to turn out all the lights, close your eyes, put your hand over your face, and then say, okay, now you're getting an idea of the level of darkness that you're working with. So we go into these places as an attempt to try to explore them, understand them, protect them, sometimes exploit them for scientific purposes. Next slide. And in the process, we do all kinds of things. We crawl through things, we get on ropes, we go down through things. And most people are aware of that, that you go in a cave, you crawl, you get muddy, you get dirty, you go on ropes, you stay high above things. Next slide. But did you know that you could ride kayaks through caves? You can also take inner tubes. You can dive. People scuba dive through caves. I don't. Other people do, though. And there's all kinds of aspects to this hobby and to this lifestyle that aren't really well known by a lot of people. And that's one of the things that I do as a photographer is I try to share that. It's easier to take a picture sometimes than it is to try to describe it or to record a video of it. And ultimately, it is so we can go to places, next slide, to places like this, these beautiful, fantastic places that are difficult to describe even when you're there. They're difficult to kind of process. And we get to do this all over the country. Some people do it all over the world. And bringing these places to the public is a way to bring broader awareness to what's down there, why it's, worth protecting, and to other cavers as well. Some of these places are actually so fragile and so delicate that access is very strictly controlled. In fact, in a couple of these, in at least one of these pictures, we were only there for the express purpose of taking pictures. And part of the argument for that was if there's pictures, then nobody else has to really have a reason to go there. And just the physical, just us being there, even for pictures, even if we're just standing there doing nothing, we are doing damage to that environment. So even if you just go and look at it and you don't touch anything, you stay nice and in the middle, you're still leaving an impact. And over the years, that adds up. Next slide. We also do things like scientific exploration and documentation. This is a picture from a cave in Pennsylvania of us surveying the ceiling to find the angle of the rock, of the rock structure in there. And next slide. And it's also, a way to try to capture like cavers and who we are, what we do. People think of caving as this super serious. I mean, most people, when you think of caving, you think of like The Descent, or those horror movies that we like to watch and laugh at. People think of it as this super serious, professional thing, and it is serious, it is professional because you have to be safe. You don't want to do it in such a way that you hurt yourself or somebody else. But I've had one person, next slide, say that they wish that they could have a GoPro video to record some of the stuff that we do in our downtime in a cave because we're one cast member away from Jackass. Cavers are a phenomenal group of people. There are pictures that I wish I could share here that I considered, but I won't, because it's pictures of rescues of cavers coming together to pull injured people out of a cave, usually another caver. Those are also important parts of the stories. We do sometimes do very strange, next slide, very strange things to get to where we need to go to. Things that, let's be fair, I actually didn't do that. I let him float back and forth while I took the picture. I have no desire to actually do that. But, documenting these things to try to show to other people, the desire and the drive that we have to go do this stuff. Next slide. And ultimately, that's what I do. And so for this presentation, what I'll largely be talking about is the different types of pictures that we take. I will touch on gear. I'll talk about that a little bit. And for some pictures, I will talk about the technical aspects if it's, specific to a specific picture. But it's hard to say this and sound believable, but the technical aspect is kind of a small part of what I do. It's kind of cut and repeat a little bit. It's pretty similar from picture to picture. The exposure settings and the lighting settings and everything. What really is more important is the story and the emotions that you're trying to convey in the details of it. This is one of the few pictures that I have that has the camera and the picture that I was taking at the same time. This was shooting a macro picture of these small helictite formations. So for scale, this is about 1.5 inches long, and it was on a formation that was out of frame from the other one. And that was shot on 4x5 Provia slide film. And I'm only mentioning the technical details because it's the only successful 4x5 picture I have from a cave for now. So obviously I didn't get to here overnight. This has been a years-long process. I've been a caver for 10 years, but I didn't just wake up one morning and decide I wanted to go caving. I didn't meet somebody somewhere and they said, hey, we're gonna go in a cave this weekend. Do you want to go with us? Next slide. My story with all of this starts from before I guess I can before I can remember. My grandparents took me all over this country. They took me to all over all these different places, and from the earliest years, they taught me two things, and that is, one, to never stop exploring the world, and also to take pictures while you're doing it. Next slide. So, of course, the natural world involves caves, so they took me to caves. I think this was the first cave that I was ever in. You'll notice that I am this small, shivering child. Caves are not warm. They are kind of cold sometimes. You'll notice that I was refusing to wear my jacket, and as anybody who still works with me in a cave will attest, I am still very ill-prepared sometimes, and I shiver and freeze and complain and get very grouchy. That's why I'm with Hope now, because she remembers to bring my jackets and my clothes for me. Next slide. So they took me to caves all over the country, and that natural desire to do stuff like this and to take pictures while doing it was really always there. It was fostered by them, and it was just a natural progression into doing what I do now. When I was in high school, next slide. When I was in high school, I bought a copy of this book because I was interested in reading about the cave itself. It was the subject of a National Geographic documentary that had kind of gotten my interest as a kid. But by this point, I was also a photographer. I was taking pictures of waterfalls and mountains and places like that. And I saw this picture on the cover, and I was just amazed by it. I was amazed by the idea of this passage being lit up like this, and the leading line of the people walking off into the distance, and then of course that mystery of what's on the other side. It just ends in blackness. What is there? What is around the next corner? And I thought, boy, that would be really interesting to take pictures of stuff like that. So I was good friends at that time with the owner of a local commercial cave in Pennsylvania. I convinced him to, next slide, I convinced him to let me go caving and to take a camera in with me. So I also convinced my grandfather to let me borrow a couple pieces of his equipment. I borrowed a lens and a flash, I believe. And they paired me with a random cave guide who is in this picture. And I went and took pictures in this cave. And there's very few moments in your life that you can look back at something and go, that everything changed there. Things were never the same again. But this was an inflection point. I took these pictures. It was an amazing experience, and I have become the greatest of lifelong friends with that cave guide over the last 10 years. And in the process of doing this, I learned some very basic things about working in caves and working with lights in this environment, because I have no formal training in any of this. I have no training in studio lighting, technical lighting, nothing. This is all kind of learning as you go. The only advantage I had was that I was shooting all this on digital, so I didn't have to wait 3 weeks for film to come back and find out that they were all terrible. Some things that I learned: no matter how dim you think the light is, it will always be visible. That light, that little red light there, was about that bright on the ground, about as bright as the laser pointer next to it, and you can see that it lit up the ceiling up there as well. I tried to do the starburst effect. That clearly didn't work out too well. But the number one thing that I learned is that caves are dark and you shouldn't move around in the darkness without a light on, because I was trying to move around to set up lights, and I walked right into that rock right there and gave myself a concussion. So it was a very auspicious start to 10 years of doing this at this point. Next slide. But I also learned some technical things too. I learned some really cool things. I learned that you can backlight things, and you can highlight these different aspects of caving, right? Like the caver's hair and the breath, the cloud of breath that they produce as they're moving through the cave. I also learned, next slide, that if you backlight formations, they're translucent, so they glow, which is really cool, but also incredibly difficult to kind of get right without destroying all the light around it. So I learned all of this, and then I went to school, and I will be entirely upfront and say that I went to school for engineering, but whether or not that school had a caving club was absolutely a factor in deciding where to go. When I toured a bunch of schools, and when I showed up at WVU, right in their rec center, they had a poster for the caving club, and that was what made my decision. Next slide. So I joined the student caving organization there. They took me caving, and they put up with me dragging this giant Pelican box. It's literally this big. It weighs like 60 pounds when it's fully loaded with gear. Taking it through caves, they put up with that for much longer than they probably should have. And they taught me how to do things like get on rope and rappel and go places. And in that first year, I got to do some really cool things. This picture here on the left, the one from what says Elkhorn Mountain Cave, that was the first picture that I took that ever got published. It was used as the cover of a member's manual directory for the National Speleological Society in spring of 2014. And then the WVU trip to Alabama in March is the first time I destroyed a camera because I dropped the camera down a pit. And it fell, I don't know, about 160 feet. And as you can imagine, it didn't survive. We'll talk a little bit more about gear in a little bit and how hard this stuff is on gear. Next slide. But as it turns out, I learned that growing up in Southwest Pennsylvania put me in some very good company. There were at least 3 other cave photographers within 15 minutes of where I grew up that were nationally known for their work. And so I became friends with them. And one of them was a guy named Ed McCarthy. And he taught me a lot of things, probably the most important of which is that you should never be offended when somebody directly copies your work, because that is usually a compliment, because I directly copied Ed's work for at least a year as I was learning how to do this. It was these ideas about compositions, and mostly it became a way to learn how to do technical things, because I could see these compositions in my head, but I couldn't actually figure out how to get what I want. It wasn't fully formed in my head as an image yet. And so seeing his work, next slide, and being able to try to emulate that and work with that was actually a really good way to learn some of the technical aspects of what I was doing. And if these pictures look really similar, that is because they are the exact same moment in time, actually. This was a trip that he and I took together in December of 2013, and he never stopped giving me shit for the fact that I crouched down, and on his, you can see the light glowing through and reflecting off of the surface of the water, and that is technically a technical fault as far as most cave photographers are concerned. And even over the years, next slide, even over the years, I still copied his work from time to time, mostly because I would go places and I would be determined I have to take a different picture than Ed McCarthy. And then I'd get there and go, wow, that is the only picture, okay? Nothing else is remotely as good. So I would end up just copying his work. And I worked with a lot of people over the years to learn what I do. I worked with people that are newer than me, the people that have been doing it for decades longer than I have. And I wish I could talk about every single one of them. Next slide. But the one, what's that?
On that last picture, was that your picture on the right?
Yes, that is my picture on the right. His is over on the left.
It looks better exposed.
Well, part of that is he shot his on Kodachrome 200, and I think that's a process of the scanning, because I've actually seen that slide in person, and it's not blown out that way. Yeah, so the slide in person is actually similar to what mine is.
Okay.
But there is one person that I do want to mention, because, as I said, I kind of got inspired by this whole National Geographic documentary about a cave. And as it turns out, the guy who took the pictures for that lives in Southern Virginia. And in 2014, I spent a summer in Yellowstone at the same time that he was there. And I was really familiar with one thing and one thing only in Yellowstone, and that was geysers, and how to see geysers and when different geysers was going to erupt. He was there for the bicentennial National Geographic edition magazine on the National Park System, and he had one goal. He needed to photograph geysers. And somehow we managed to get together, and I was showing him how to see these geysers one day. And while talking to him, I casually mentioned that I was a caver, and he mentioned to me that he took that picture there on the right. And I was like, wow, what a coincidence. That's one of the pictures that inspired me to do what I want to do. So I worked with him for off and on through that summer. And there were a few things that he imparted into me that others didn't. And it was this idea of telling stories with these pictures. It's not just, yeah, you know, you can get the lighting right and you don't blow something out and the colors look good. But this picture looks a lot nicer by the fact that that person is blurred, because you can tell that they're moving. It's no longer a static object. It's no longer, you can tell the difference between the cave, which isn't moving, and the person, which is. And you can tell that this person has fire on their head because of the warmth of the lights and how it contrasts with everything else. And so I learned that from him, and that never went away. That ended up affecting my work forever, both above and below ground. So next slide. So when you go caving, you start usually by driving out into the absolute middle of nowhere. This is a cabin in Montana, 4 hours from the nearest paved road. Absolutely no cell service. If you hurt yourself, you're kind of screwed. So you got to get out to where these places are. Caves tend to form in places that have no reason for the average human to be there. Next slide. Usually. Sometimes they're right next to the road, and the most dangerous thing of the cave trip is not getting hit by a car when you come out of it. So that's step one. You got to get to the cave. Next slide. Step two. You have all this gear. That's not even the photo gear. That's just the gear to go. Well, I guess the tripod's the photo gear, but the rest of it isn't photo gear. The rest of it is gear to go through a cave that had 6 rope drops in it, plus a couple of extra things that you needed to rig some lines so you didn't fall down a hole.
Those are the boxes.
Not all of that was photo gear on that trip, though. I had other things in there, and I can't remember what at this point. But most of that actually was not photo gear, except for the tripod. So you get all the gear together, and now, next slide, now you got to hike to the cave. And that sometimes is more of an experience than the cave itself, such as this. I nearly died of heat stroke to get this picture because this was in the rainforest in Cuba. And don't let the guy wearing coveralls fool you. It was 88 degrees when I took that picture, and I was dying trying to keep up with him. But that was the picture that I wanted to get, this idea of, going through the forest and having it kind of blur your way around you, because that's what I was experiencing. I was starting to die of heat stroke. My vision was blurring, and all I knew was follow the guy with the yellow pack, and he knows where he's going. Next slide. And then you get to the entrance itself, and the entrance itself is frequently a source of images in their own right. There are trips that I have gone on where I have spent an hour, 2 hours, or even the entire trip just at the entrance of the cave and playing with the light and what's going on there. In this case, you have somebody who's walking up out of the entrance, and you have somebody standing down inside the cave, lighting up the foggy room inside of it. This picture has a bit of a technical error, as you might be able to see it down here, this cable. This was very early in my shooting career with trying to synchronize flash bulbs with a camera. And I'll get into the details of it later, but essentially I had to hardwire the flash bulbs into the camera itself. And so that cable runs all the way down to where that person is standing, and then I forgot to clone brush it out later. Next slide. So sometimes they're those big walk-in entrances, and sometimes they are these giant yawning chasms that you have to rappel into. This is one of the few times that I will talk very specifically about gear. The advent of digital cameras with sensors that have very high sensitivities is a very good thing, because frequently pictures like this, they work best when the skies are overcast, so you don't have direct sunlight coming in, you don't have harsh lighting and harsh shadows. The trade-off is it is very dark. And you're kind of free floating out in the middle of nowhere, so tripods are kind of iffy at that point.
Ryan, we have a question from online. Meredith is asking, who took the National Geographic cover photo?
All right, so the question was, who took the National Geographic cover photo? That was Michael Nichols. Folks from Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia would know him better as Nick. He took some other famous photos of, I think he was National Geographic's cave photographer for quite a while. All right, so yeah, the gear comes in handy there. That's one of the few times where gear really does make a difference. The camera that I started shooting with was a crop sensor SLR, and it just didn't have the light performance for me to be able to take a picture like this. This was with the first full frame sensor that I owned. Next slide. And sometimes these entrances, they're really dynamic. Like they're not just, it's not just fog and mist, but you got waterfalls, you got these a whole bunch of things that you can record. And this is where the different aspects of photography of these places start to overlap. This picture here on the right isn't just a picture of a waterfall. It is also a picture of a geologic contact. And that's part of the reason why I took the picture. This rock from here down is a different limestone than the rock above it. And it is important because that contact between those two different rock layers just around the corner, if you go around there, forms a 440-foot deep hole. And that's what the rope is for, is to go down the hole. And so that was part of the reason why I took this picture. But why take a picture of it just to take a picture of it? Let's set it up on a tripod and put a polarizer on it and take this nice picture of a waterfall in the process. Just because it needs to be technical doesn't mean it can't be, beautiful and aesthetic at the same time. Not so much with the one on the left. The one on the left is actually just a picture of a waterfall within an entrance, actually. But it does start to speak to things like you want contrasting colors to try to bring the person out in the picture. Thus why that person is wearing a yellow shirt with a yellow light on their head while everything else is quite blue around them, because it helps you figure out who the human is versus not. Next slide. And within these entrances, when you do have sunshine, then you start to have a whole different ballgame to work with. You start to get sun that shines into these entrances, and they light up the mist, they light up the fog, and you have to work with that harsh lighting. And you're going to have to accept that you get basically one of two things. You're either going to get these high contrast images that expose for the sun, or these relatively low contrast images that end up blowing things out in the highlights. Yes, sometimes you can set up lights and strobes and stuff to fill light things, but I've tried that. My personal style is simple, is sometimes better, especially with caves, because caves can be so abstract. And instead of lighting everything up and showing everything all at once, I typically try to go for a more isolationist view, such as the picture here on the left. Next slide. And sometimes you just kind of get the best of both worlds, actually, like this picture here, which was taken with a wide-angle lens, holding it directly over top of this hole in the ground with this person rappelling into it. And that's mostly what this is about, is to try to show that difference between the surface, which makes sense to most people, right? There's snow, there's dead leaves, and there's a couple rocks and some moss, and then what's inside the hole, which is completely foreign to most anybody else. And for that matter, most people wouldn't even see this, because you wouldn't be able to stand there and not fall in at the same time. So that's why you stand there and take the picture. Next slide. And then once you're in the cave away from the entrance, you start to deal with a whole bunch of other issues. You got to crawl through things, which starts to become its own form of photography that is better suited to wide-angle lenses and to these real dynamic perspectives of having somebody push something in your face, or because that's what you experience when you're going through crawls like this. The person behind you says, "Hey, my pack is stuck and I can't move it." And so you turn around, and 9 times out of 10, that pack is right here in front of your nose, if it doesn't hit you in the face. And you got to grab it and pull it and dislodge it. And that's more or less, what it looks like while you're doing it. You'll notice he's wearing a dust mask in this picture. That is not normal for most caves. This cave is near a known uranium deposit, and the dust is radioactive. Mostly from radon, I believe. So we wore that so we didn't get cancer. Next slide. And sometimes they're not dry, sometimes they're kind of muddy, kind of sloppy, and this is where, you know, pictures like this really start to show the different styles of caving, and different people enjoying different things, the things that you got to go through to get to some of these places, and the things that we do for exploration. You know, this is just travel, next slide, but this was not travel. This was actually original exploration in a cave in Pennsylvania that I was the only person small enough to fit in, so I sat there for the picture, someone else tripped the shutter for me, but this tells an entirely different kind of story. You'll notice I have no helmet on because I can't fit through with the helmet on. You'll notice I have a sledgehammer in my hand. And the sledgehammer is because I got into something, and then when I tried to come back out, I couldn't fit. So the sledgehammer made it so I could fit. Just, again, all different kinds of stories, all different kinds of environments that you're trying to show here that are involved in these trips and these things that we do. So you go through the cave, you get to where you're trying to get to, and it's time to take a picture. And it depends on the picture you're trying to take, exactly how you're going to do it. This is a very large, dry, pleasant cave in New Mexico. Everybody was more than happy to stand there and hold flashes and hold lights and let me think through my paces. I'm actually going to go back a slide. Versus that one where even for me as a photographer, like I had no desire to be there any longer than I had to. And so, you know, you set up these lights in advance and then you wait for people to come through and you take the pictures and hope that you got it, because I just don't have the heart sometimes to ask people to do really miserable things for very long periods of time. But you get to these places and the next challenge is envisioning the picture. And not only are you trying to envision a composition, but you're trying to envision lighting at the same time. And maybe for some studio photographers, you start to appreciate that idea that you have control over everything, which is great and terrible, because then that means that you have all the variables and you don't know which ones you want to pick. And you don't have a lot of time to do this because then people are going to get cold and hungry and cranky. So you kind of have to pick which one you think is going to give you the best results and kind of roll with it. And so you know, in places like this, like where this picture was taken, this was a very challenging place to work in because you have all these formations, you have all of these columns and everything in the background, and you have to figure out, where do I want to light? Which ones do I want to light up? Do I want to light them all up? Do I want to light up just one of them? You don't ever really know, and then you know sometimes you start taking pictures and go, nah, that wasn't really what I wanted. So it becomes a bit of a challenge that can be very hard to describe. It's something that one of these days I really want to try to be able to capture a photo series of what it's like to try to take a picture in a place like this versus, next slide, versus a place like this where the picture just kind of shows itself. I mean, I set up the tripod. I was going to take a picture of this nice passage with these people standing in it, and then I went back to get something else and thought, boy, it'd be cool if I stood in the foreground there. That would be a cool little thing to do. So sometimes these pictures just kind of jump out at you, and there's just one way that the cave is begging, take my picture this way. So you get there, you come up with the picture that you want, the one you want to try to get, and now you got to deal with gear. This is one of the other few slides that has nothing but text on it, because I'm going to go through this real quick. Camera-wise, I've always stuck with Canons, and that's mostly because of their, at least to me, perceived durability. I beat the crap out of my gear, as you're going to see in some of these pictures, and the ones that survive are the ones that I stick with. I had a Canon T3i that I had for 2 years, and the only thing that killed it was throwing it down a 170-foot pit. I had a Canon 5D that eventually died because one of the buttons stopped working and it got annoying to work with. But that thing had been underwater 3 times, including saltwater. And every time I tried to rotate the dial at the top, I had to use my fingernail because it was so caked in dirt up there that you couldn't roll it with your thumb anymore. Same with the Canon AE1s and the Fs and EF1s. Those older those film cameras were just built like tanks. I mean, I have tripped and fallen, and I have seen other people trip and fall, and the camera hits them in the head, and it gives them a concussion, and the camera is just perfectly fine. And that was what ended up making my decisions, on which cameras I wanted to buy for medium format. I have a Mamiya 645 and an RB67, and both of those are simply because I know that those cameras can be really beat up, despite what most studio photographers would think specifically about the 6.7. And then for a 4x5, I shoot with what I call a Frankendorf. It's a Deerdorf that somebody else built and called it a Prinzdorf, and then I had to fix it, and so I took parts from like 3 different speed graphics and Frankensteined it all together, and now it's a Frankendorf. Lenses, doesn't really matter. I've very rarely do I deal with issues with, fast lenses, slow lenses. The lighting that I use kind of takes care of itself, so it doesn't really matter to me what lens I'm using, so long as it's in one of those 35 millimeter equivalent focal ranges. I tend to use either very wide or a standard or a short telephoto. And of course the short telephoto is also a macro. Film-wise, if I'm shooting film in a cave, I tend to shoot Kodak Ektachrome because it's a bit more forgiving of a slide film. If it's something that I need a little bit more sensitivity out of, I will sometimes go with Fuji Provia. It's a little bit faster, in my experience at least. If I'm shooting color negatives, I stick usually with Portra 400 because it's a bit contrasty and kind of saturated. And then for black and white, I'm an Ilford Delta person through and through. I shoot Kodak black and white because somebody gave it to me for free. Let's see. All right, next slide. And so you got all this gear, and that's all got to go in the cave with you. And you can't just take it in the cave because the cave will beat it up. So you got to put it in these boxes. This is us getting ready one morning before a trip. You can see Breakfast of Champions in there somewhere. I think this was a bunch of glazed donut holes or something. And this is trying to get all this gear together, all of these different lights. As you can notice, there's flash bulbs, there's strobes down here in a box down here. This lens is in its own box. And so not only are these people like going in the cave and sitting in these positions for you, they are carrying like 40 pounds worth of my crap through there with them. It really, that's part of the reason why on the front slide it says Under a Rock, aka Under a Rock Photography. Because I don't like putting my own name on my photos online because it makes it look like it's really more of me than it actually is sometimes. You can't, I have done this solo. I have done solo cave photo trips and they are absolutely terrible. So this is impossible without all the other people here to help carry stuff like this in the cave and to keep your gear intact. Next slide. And then once you take it in, no matter what you put it in, at least with me, it seems like it still gets pretty damn dirty. This is my 5D. After a fairly dirty, but not the dirtiest trip, you can still read all the lettering on the camera body, so the mud's not that bad. Same with the lenses. You can read that, you can tell that's a 16 to 35 lens. You can see where the autofocus buttons are on the macro lens. The dirt is not that bad. The controller, the flash controller, yeah, that's just a throwaway. I go through like one of those a year. And so this is taking it out of the cave before I clean it. And in my experience, what I find is water is okay, mud is okay, dust is not, and total immersion is not. So don't dunk it in a puddle, that's bad. And don't get in a dust cloud, that's bad. But everything else in between is fine. So like all that mud, so long as I clean it by getting the camera wet first, it's fine. It'll wipe right off and it will not affect the camera for the most part over the span of its life. Next slide. And so for lighting, I typically work with one of 3 different types of lights. I do not use LEDs. I do not use constant lighting for a bunch of different reasons. Namely, the power sources are very difficult to take into a cave. You need something that has batteries associated with them. The batteries become heavy. They become a bit of a pain in the butt to work with. And then for that matter, in my experience, most LEDs, the color rendering on them is terrible. They are not consistent with each other, and I am spending hours at home in Photoshop trying to color balance everything, and it's just a mess. So I typically go for things like strobes and flash bulbs. These are the strobes that I used to use. I used to use cheap Yongnuo ones. I don't use them anymore. I use Godox ones now. They are basically the exact same thing with one very critical difference. The on-off button on the Godox is a slider, and that's a push button. And as soon as you get dirt stuck in the on-off button, the strobe cycles on and off forever, and it doesn't do anything for you anymore. Whereas with the Godoxes, I don't really have that issue. These are also, at least for me, they tend to be throwaways. I go through like 3 of them a year. So whatever model costs like around like 50, 60 bucks, that's what I usually buy, because there's just no point in getting something more expensive. For me, they do the same thing and they die just as quickly. Next slide. And so what strobes are good for is for very narrow directed lighting where you want to focus your light on very specific things and you have very complicated situations. Like this picture here on the left, I use, I think, 5 different strobes, which is 2 more than I usually only use 3. But there's one from way over here off to the left pointing at these formations. There is one that I had hidden down here that was lighting up the side of this and lighting up onto the ceiling. I have one more hidden back here with a makeshift snoot that is shooting up to backlight those formations to make them a bit brighter. And then finally, I had another one from the side over here to provide the lighting that you see on Hope. And all of these are directed and they are shadowed, so that way the background is completely darkened and you can't see anything, which is remarkably difficult because 2 feet behind her is another wall of formations. And it's actually remarkably difficult to not light them up in the process. Same with the one on the right. There's formations right behind where the person is sitting. You can see some of them peeking out from around there. But the difficulty associated with this particular formation, this is a sheet of rock. It's a sheet of calcite that has been deposited on the wall, and it is about that thick. It is about 1/4 of an inch thick, and when you backlight it, it glows like that. And there's nowhere to put lights behind it that you're not gonna break something else, or that you're gonna light up things that you don't wanna light up. And so the only option that I had was to put the light down here, and as you can see, it still blew out part of the floor. So they're not perfect, but for these really difficult dynamic scenes, that's the best option that you typically have. If I need more light, next slide. If I need more light, I switch over to flash bulbs. And it depends. If I either need more light or a different kind of light. You know, strobes are very directed. They have these narrow beams. Flash bulbs, they send light everywhere in all different directions if you don't have a reflector on them. So I can either get light that is going everywhere, going all out in all directions, which is its own different type of lighting effects, or just brute force, I need a shitload of light, and that's where it's coming from, because one of these is like the equivalent of like 1,000 strobes in one go. Next slide. They're used for places like this, really, really big open spaces. I mean, to give you a sense of scale, that's a friend of mine down at the bottom of this rope drop, and that's me, like 2/3 of the way up, and that's the top. So the rope drop from the ledge down to the floor is 440 feet. To give you a sense of scale over here for this picture, these are 2 folks standing about 80 feet away from the camera. That is a person on rope on the wall above this waterfall, and that waterfall is 120 feet tall. So that is about the size of a small football stadium. The fog that you see, those are clouds in the room from the room generating its own weather patterns. This room also was doing the same thing, but I didn't light it up in such a way that you could see it. Next slide. Sometimes I use blue flash bulbs. I tend to try not to use them anymore for this reason. Next slide. For this reason. I went and took pictures, and I had somebody, actually this was Hope, I had Hope sit on rope as she climbed, and she fired the bulb over and over again, and you will notice that every single light is a different color. And that is mostly because the blue coating on bulbs, as it ages, it changes color. Some of these things, I mean, they were made literally in the 1930s. They are, you know, nearly 100 years old. And as they burn, they change colors as well. And ultimately what I did was I now use clear flash bulbs. And my strobes, I have orange gels over top of them to balance the strobes with the clear bulbs. If I need to use them at the same time. Next slide. Somehow I managed to put this out of order, but this is another picture of that gigantic room that has, that we used 2 of the big screw bases. Actually these, which was a segue. I'm not gonna set it off, it's already been set off, don't worry. Which is a good segue into talking about these bulbs because they don't make the gear anymore to set them off. So all of the gear that we use to set off flash bulbs, we have to build. So this is a flash gun that I built specifically for using in a cave. If it looks familiar, it's an oven drip pan. And it's wired to a 9-volt battery. This is a very basic model. Some of the more complicated ones are ones like these, which actually, you can't really tell from here, but they have the ability to wire into radio slaves. And inside there's a custom circuitry that I made to be able to fire these flash bulbs with a radio slave that synchronizes with a digital camera, which is much harder than it sounds actually. Because flash bulbs and strobes have 2 very different timing sequences to them. And then of course, if I don't need to do all that, I can use a trusty Tiltomite. I still have, I don't know, I got a bag of like 50 of these at home. And if I need one, I rip them apart and put new insides in them and clean them up and continue using them. So flash bulbs are great, but they're also really tricky because everything is old or it's custom built. And I'd say a third of the time, nothing happens. You turn the lights out, everybody goes and sets off the flashes and only one goes off, or one goes off and it explodes, and I mean really explodes. It's an experience using them. Next slide. But when they work spectacularly. Like for a picture like this is a picture of somebody reading what's called an optical clinometer. It was taken on a survey trip. So we are going through the cave and we are actually measuring the cave and drawing a map of it using this tape measure down here and the optical sighting instruments above. And one of the things that you do to do that is you put the optical instrument down on a rock and you hold a light off to one side so you can shine the light in the side and you can see the numbers inside of it. And so I wanted to get a picture of her doing that, but instead of holding her headlamp, what I asked her to do was to just hold a Tiltomite with the reflector off of it. And what you get is this bare flash bulb light source. And with a very narrow f-stop, I think I used like an aperture of like f32 or something, you get that starburst effect. So you can use bulbs for these huge open spaces, or you can use them for these really tiny spaces when you want these unique lighting patterns. And if you combine the two together, you have the ability to get these really dynamic pictures. Like, here I was using a strobe in the foreground that was snooted down so that way it just lit up Hope here on this rock. And then this is actually her in the same picture twice. And then she turned around and she used a flash bulb in a Tiltomite, which puts out a flat wall of light in all directions to get that lighting effect in the background. And when you combine these together, you just get these really, really dynamic pictures. This ability to just flood places with this harsh lighting from these flash bulbs, but then also have this real narrow light at just one part of the image. And it works, it works great for all kinds of things. I mean, it's like, it is my go-to lighting setup usually is strong backlight and then targeted directional front lighting. Because as you're moving through a cave, that is what you see. You're walking with a group of people, somebody says something and you stop and turn around and the person behind you is looking at you and everybody else behind them is looking at you and everything is backlit. So this lighting that's coming back, I mean, that is more or less the picture that I saw from the top of this pit was somebody said something to me. I looked down and there was a person standing right underneath where Hope was. And when they looked up, their light backlit, that pit. And that was the picture that I wanted to get. And so this actually segues into a whole different kind of photography, which is photography in a cave on rope, which, as you can imagine, has some very interesting logistical challenges, especially when there's no floor. So this is a picture of another cave photographer who's also my age that I do a lot of work with. And he is kicking off of, so the rope normally lands him with his feet on the floor down here. He is kicking off of the wall to pendulum across the pit to grab a strobe that we had sat on a ledge, and the floor is 100 feet below him. And so he's trying to do this while trying to reach it to grab the strobe but not drop it in the process, because that would obviously hurt it. And I do like the strobes, despite the fact that I kill them pretty frequently. But as I was watching him swing out, I said to him, like, man, that's a cool picture. Can I take a picture of you doing this? And he says, yeah. So he kicks out and I take the picture. And I said, okay, you can get the strobe. And he goes, okay, but I need like 3 minutes to get my vision back because you set that off like right in my face while I was swinging into it. So working at height on ropes with photo gear is you can have a bunch of different presentations about different parts of this all at once, because there's just all different kinds of ways of doing it. Such as, the classic way is to get a picture from the bottom of these spaces looking up as somebody climbs and they set off a light repeatedly. And this is, again, you don't really see it at first until you start to talk about the nuances of how you do this, but you have different kinds of lights for this. This pit over here is relatively narrow, and so I was using strobes, which have a relatively narrow beam, and they can put the light farther up the pit without blowing out the walls. This pit, however, is just, it's a big open circular, it feels like you're looking up a toilet paper tube, actually, the inside of like a cardboard tube. And so I was using flash bulbs for those because the bulbs put out that nice even wall of light, and it really highlights the shape of the space that you're moving up through. And when you're at the top looking down, next slide, same basic thing. The picture on the right is using 2 strobes backlit, looking back up from the bottom. I wanted to use that because I didn't want to blow the walls out down around it. And I wanted to get that light as far up the pit as I possibly could. Whereas for the picture over on the left, this, of this person sitting on rope at the top of this big pit, I didn't want to light up the whole pit. I just wanted to show that they were hanging on rope next to this bottomless abyss, basically, and capture this feeling of sitting on a rope, doing your thing, and next to you is this column of white water falling into total nothingness. And so for that, we just used a bare flash bulb, which actually worked out really well, because then the light wraps around, it bounces off the walls, and it kind of wraps around, and it's able to provide this fill lighting in here. And this is a good example of knowing your gear and how far you can push it. This was at the absolute limit of the highlight retention of my camera. And any more, and it would have been completely not recovered, and every flash bulb I tried to set off after this didn't go off. In fact, this was the last picture of the trip. So if it didn't work, well, then I guess we would have done all that for nothing.
Was that person actually working their way down into that?
Yes. So that's, you're out of the waterfall for most of it. But when you get down about 200 feet, that water kind of comes over top of you, and that's a whole different ballgame at that point. But I do want to talk about water, because water is one of the most enjoyable things to photograph in a cave, because there's so many different ways that you can do it, and it's so dynamic, and it's so varied, and it for me it's motion. It is motion that I can capture, and it's great, and there's just so many different ways to do it. This is, in particular, is using a single flash bulb, lighting this person from behind, but it's a special flash bulb. It's called an FP26, which stands for focal plane. They were made for cameras that have focal plane shutters, so you can shoot really high shutter speeds. The bulb burns for a very long time. And as a result, when you burn it, it gives you this streaking motion because it allows that water to move while the light is going off. Whereas with something like a strobe, the water gets frozen in time. Next slide. And this is an example of those two different approaches. Over here, this picture was taken with a strobe. And you'll notice that the water is completely frozen in time. It almost looks like ice or glass. Whereas this picture, oh, that's fine. Whereas this picture, actually I'm just gonna scoot it out of the way so I don't step on it. It's fine. Okay. Whereas this picture was taken with synchronized flash bulbs, and it actually gets that motion, you get more of the motion of the waterfall imparted into it by that. And sometimes when you combine these pictures together, you get pictures that look like this, where I use the flash bulb, again, one of the focal plane flash bulbs, from behind to backlight the water and get that sense of motion. But I use the strobe for fill lighting in the front, and if you zoom in closely to the middle of the picture, you'll notice that in some places the water's frozen solid, and in some places it's streaked. So it's all about, that how is it that you want to, what is the story that you want to tell with it here? And in this case, I guess I was a little confused. I couldn't figure out which story I wanted to tell, but it worked. When it's not moving vertically, water becomes this really dynamic aspect of these compositions, and it's great for pictures like this where you're trying to explain to somebody like, okay, we go into these places, they're half full of water, it's 40 degrees, it's unbelievably cold, you can't feel your toes anymore, and we are moving through the cave with a tape measure. And we're starting at one spot, we're going to the next, and we're drawing a picture of what this thing looks like, all the while wondering, when are we gonna be done? Because I wanna go have pizza and beer. And it's usually when that person who is drawing, when they can't feel their fingers anymore and they can't actually make the pencil go where they want it to go, that's usually when we stop. And pictures like this, they are great for showing environments like that. I mean, none of this is contrived. None of this was an actual survey trip. That guy is actually covered in mud. He is trying to keep his hands clean because you don't want to get the survey book dirty. And that water it goes all the way up around his back. So he is just completely soaked at that point. And looking way more comfortable than he actually was. And these scenes of moving through passages like that, I mean, they're dynamic. They're kind of beautiful, I think. They're very mysterious. Some people, they get a weird form of anxiety looking at it because there's so many questions, right? Like, what's behind him? What's in front of him? What's under him? These are very real questions because sometimes the water is muddy and you can't really see what's in there and you're standing on a rock and then you take the next step and you're over your head. So these are very real, these aren't contrived scenes with these questions that artistically we try to make these questions. These are very real things that we deal with while we're caving. And sometimes, you just get real involved with all this stuff. You get down, I actually had to dig this spot out a little bit to fit through it so I didn't have to lay my face down in the water. But it's again, it's moving through and trying to get this really dynamic scene that you're only seeing in a glimpse in an instant, at the same time trying to do it in a way that conveys the story to people who aren't familiar with, an environment where you would lay face down in the water, I guess. And in larger spaces, water it continues to be it's so varied, it's so dynamic. When it's in big pools like this and it's this really beautiful greenish blue color because it's got all this dissolved calcite in it. This is another example, by the way, of a photo with multiple purposes. This is another geologic contact. So this is a different limestone, the yellow stuff versus the gray stuff above it. And in that particular cave, that contact is very important to understanding how the cave formed. And so that was the original point of taking that picture, was to document that geologic structure. And oh, by the way, he's on rope next to a waterfall. So let's put a strobe behind him and backlight that waterfall. Or, this picture of over here on the right of paddling in a kayak through these big open spaces with all the formations hanging down, and trying to get these pictures to capture things like the droplets landing in the water in the foreground. And I didn't put the picture in there, but somewhere there is a picture of me cupping my camera and holding it down to get this picture. And the bottom of my hands and up to my knuckles is in the water. And the camera it's the skin to skin contact keeping the camera out of it. And when water builds up in these big pools and you light up the pools from inside, they just glow these, beautiful turquoise blue. Again, not photoshopped, not contrived. That is the color of calcite-laden water. The only part of this that was pre-planned, other than the fact that we were there to take the picture in the first place, was me asking Hope to wear something blue because it matches the color of the water. And it becomes, again, this segues into another part of why we take pictures, because it's important to document things like water and what water does, because water is the reason the caves exist, and it is literally the lifeblood of our earth. You guys live here next to the Chesapeake Bay and the oceans. You appreciate why you need clean water. In places like caves, people appreciate that they need clean water, but they don't realize where their water is going, where it's coming from. Here, if you spill oil in your driveway, you know where it's going. It's going to the Chesapeake Bay. Here, if you spill something in this stream that's dropping into this cave, it might come out 25 miles away in a completely different county, moving to a completely different watershed. It is not uncommon, actually, to have systems where water is sinking into the ground, such as this. And this hillside is if you're near the Continental Divide, you can have watersheds that are draining to the Atlantic Ocean, and then they go into a cave, and they go to the other side of the mountain, and they come out, and they drain to the Pacific. So pictures like this and documenting these flow routes of this water through these systems becomes really important to trying to tell the story of conservation and what you're trying to do, what you're trying to protect, and why you're trying to protect it. And of course, in the cave, water it destroys rock. It dissolves the rock away to create the cave, but it also replaces that rock to create formations. And so water can be very powerful, like the picture of somebody sitting on rope next to this pounding waterfall that is, it's beating you up. It's hard enough to rip your light off of your helmet if you're not careful. Or it can be very, very delicate, such as this water droplet coming off of this formation, or the water droplet coming off of these formations. And what if, and then you have a whole different setup here to try to tell a completely different story. Like, do I want these formations, which are only about 1/8 of an inch in diameter? Do I want these formations completely isolated, or do I want them surrounded a little bit so people can tell that what you're seeing in the droplet is the reflection of 100 other formations sitting around it? Oh, and spoiler alert, yes. Sometimes I get dirt on my sensor, and sometimes you can see it. There's one right there. Usually I'm pretty good about catching that. This time I wasn't. And formation photography of these small features like this, they run the whole gamut of technical jargon and just trying to get all this stuff to work. This formation is only about 1/2 inch long, the one that's sticking out here. They're super delicate. They're easily broken. And when you're working in places like this, I'm trying to photograph something like this, and this is sticking out on the end of those things. And sometimes I can't get the tripod where I need to, so I gotta hand hold it. Autofocus is sometimes helpful, sometimes not in the dark. Usually I'm sitting there trying to go back and forth to get this thing in focus, and I have like 2 other people standing around me, and they're watching what I'm doing, and it's not to learn, it is to make sure I don't back up into something and break something. Because these things, some of these formations, they take hundreds of thousands of years to form, and there is more than one story of a photographer going in for that shot and breaking it. And it's just, obviously it's not worth damaging things. So, when you're dealing with this at this point, this, by the way, this is one of the few pictures that I took without a flash bulb or a strobe. This is using the LED from that person's headlamp, which happens to be a balanced high color resolution LED light. And so taking these pictures and showing where these things are, how fragile they are, that's one aspect to this. The other aspect becomes not doing something really stupid like I did in this picture and making a lot of other cavers upset. We now know by this point that you do not want to touch formations with bare skin. So you'll notice that this is actually a pristine flowstone area in the middle of a very, very muddy cave. In fact, we had to bring in a completely different change of clothes so you can get into this area, strip completely naked, and put clean clothes on. And so you'll notice, like, this person, she's walking around in these water shoes, so she doesn't mark up the formations with boots. She has clean clothes on. And then, of course, as I'm taking the picture, not thinking about it, she leans back and puts her hand down on the formation. And as a photographer, that's a cardinal sin because this is the face of what we do. Somebody on Facebook is going to see this and go, oh, I can do that. I can go touch formations. And then one thing turns into another. And next thing you know, there's videos of people licking bats on YouTube. And that's actually I'm not exaggerating with that. There's a video out of people licking bats in caves. And they said, oh, I saw somebody do this somewhere else, so it must be okay. So this becomes another thing that we have to think about. I mean, this is, in the middle of all of the lighting and not breaking the gear and not breaking you have these little nebulous, nuancy things that you got to think about when you take these pictures. And sometimes they're not very straightforward. Like this picture caused me a lot of issues when I shared it because that person looks like they are really close to that formation. And I shot it from about 20 feet away with a very long lens. I shot it again a little bit later, next slide, with a wider lens, and you'll notice that she's actually quite a good distance away from these formations. And so she has, she's not in any danger of breaking them, but that first picture, I'm going back real quick, that first picture though, that one really upset and bothered people. That was a big learning lesson for me actually, because even though I knew she was 2 or 3 feet away, clearly it doesn't look like it in that picture. And it's not just formations. I've had the opportunity to work in a number of places where the caves are closed because of the animals that live in them, such as this cave in Southern Virginia. And the whole point of being there was to photograph these little creatures. These are isopods. And to all the cave biologists that are listening in, I'm sorry in advance for butchering. It may not even be an isopod. I think it is, though. It is? Oh, good. Okay, and you'll notice it's translucent. There's no skin pigment, so you can see all of its internal organs in there. And you'll notice that it is really small. Those are millimeters in that scale bar up there. And again, now you're combining different photographic styles. This is now a macro photo that also has a technical aspect because you need a ruler in it. So a scientist can use it to figure out how big this thing is. And these things here are on this formation right there. So I think actually they were mostly clustered around here. So here I am trying to take this picture and I'm crouched down in that waterfall, trying not to get me wet. I think I had actually, you can still see this little faint fuzz right here on the image. That's actually water on the lens. And so, again, you're trying to combine all these different styles and all these different things. And you have to be a bunch of different things at once. You got to be able to take these nice, pretty pictures of these big spaces. But at the same time, you also got to be able to take these technical pictures. And we did, we've done this quite a lot actually, and it segues into taking a bunch of different other pictures at the same time. This is another isopod. This one's a little bit bigger. This is about an inch long, I think. But this was living on somewhere right in here, I think. And this guy up here, he is somebody who works for the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. He is looking for a snail that he could not find when we were there, and that made him very nervous because that means all the snails are gone. They were looking for snails, right, Hope? Was that a snail he was looking for? I lose track of the little things that we have to look for. But essentially, you know, again, it was, it was an amphipod, actually. So again, two different pictures taken at the very same instant of two very different things, but the same story, and for the same reason. You want to be able to show people, we have to protect these caves, we have to protect these places, because this creature lives right there and absolutely nowhere else in the world. Not even in the same cave sometimes. And it just continues. We're trying to show the impacts that humans have and the impacts that, you know, that we can have on these things, such as a healthy bat over on the left and a dead bat over on the right. This bat is dead because of a fungal disease. That's the white stuff all over its nose. Well, I've never seen that picture that big. Good Lord, is that dirty? You see all the dirt spots all over it. I never saw that on my computer screen. I'll have to clean that. So these, you know, these become pictures that we share as part of our efforts to try to protect these species. This particular bat is of a species that is not of much concern, but these bats here, I think like 2/3 of that entire bat species population lives in the cave that I took that picture in. Or no, a cave next to it, sorry. A cave one valley over, but it's the same species of bats. And next slide. And so we go in and we do this to take pictures of these places and to show the impacts that humans are having, the impacts it's having on the animals, and the impacts that it's having, you know, on the cave itself, and showing that, you know, why we try to protect these places and why sometimes they get closed, why they have gates on them, why we go through the things that we do to try to not have that happen. If I'm being realistic, I don't really know how to describe it other than we don't want it to happen, because then, next slide, because then we have to go in and do things like this. We have to clean it, and that takes forever. And it's hard. Sometimes it's dangerous. This is actually this cave has been partly mined out, so that ceiling was unstable while we were trying to clean it. And despite all of our efforts, 7 months later, somebody else went in there and spray painted their name on the wall. But again, you know, we use pictures like this. This isn't just to show off and go, hey, look at what we did. We share this to explain to people why you don't do things like this, or we show them to government agencies to give money to be able to protect these things, or to private donors to give money to give resources to be able to protect these things. These become very powerful stories when you can juxtapose them back and forth, you know, back and forth like that. All of this to say, there's a lot when you take a camera in a cave. There's a lot of different things that a cave photographer does. There's a lot of different things to take pictures of. There's a lot of different types of photography to try to master and get good at, and you never really get bored, because if you get bored of one thing, I mean, I went through a phase where I just wanted to take pictures of waterfalls. And then I got bored of that, and I learned how to go on rope, and I took pictures of big vertical spaces. And then I got bored of that, and now then I took pictures of those little creatures that you saw floating around. There's no one type of photography that I like the most, but I do like to end my presentations with this particular picture here, because I think it is the best example of how cave photography brings in so many different other kinds of photography and things you need to learn. This is an open air pit in Alabama, open air because this is looking up to the entrance to the surface. Those are trees, and this is a person on rope. And these blue dots are glowworms. And when you're in the cave at night in the summer months, they all glow and they all flash and they pulse, and there's fungus on the ground that glows as well. And this picture took 9 hours to take. 9 hours from the time we left the cars until the time we got back, and it tells a very long story compressed into one image. Things like those glowworms were so faint that even with a modern digital camera, I had to take it as if it was a deep sky image. We sat there in the dark in that cave for 5 hours and did absolutely nothing but watch the glowworms while that camera sat there and took picture after picture after picture to stack it so I could get an image of all of these lights, all of these glowworms on this wall without any noise. The result was like 600 or 700 different pictures comprising a total exposure time of about 3 hours just for the dots. The wall was a completely different picture. The wall was a picture, I actually did light that one up with a headlamp because the headlamp was very blue, and I wanted that bluish green lighting to help emphasize the bluish colors of those glowworms. But then I wanted to be able to show how humans interact with this space. So I asked the person with me to go on rope and sit there and hold a flash bulb to light up the space, which she did. And the light up here, actually, there was one last icing on the cake to this wonderful, wonderful memory. That is not daylight, that is not moonlight, that is lightning. We sat there and tried to time our exit with a thunderstorm squall, actually in between the thunderstorm squalls. But the result was when I was taking the picture of the glowworms, I got a bunch of pictures of lightning, so I was able to get this picture of the surface up there. And when you're climbing the ropes are tied to bolts that are in the rock. When lightning hits the ground, it sends a seismic shockwave through the ground, and you can feel the rope vibrate before you hear the thunder, which is really cool and absolutely terrifying at the same time. But I mean, again, so I like to end these presentations with this particular picture because people think about this place is actually protected by a nonprofit conservancy, and people look at it and go, well, yeah, it's protected. It's this beautiful, beautiful open air pit. But there's more to it than that. There's these microscopic little things that if you sit there and you wait at night and you watch this pit come alive, suddenly you wonder if you're on drugs or something, because it's just so out of this world. It's so you get on those ropes and you climb up out of this thing. If you have your headlamp off, you can see them on the walls. It's like climbing through stars. And then, of course, the lightning's flashing and the rope's shaking, and you're wondering if you're going to be electrocuted. But that's usually out of the scope of most people's visits to places like this. And with that, I turn it over to you guys if there's any questions anybody has about all of that. Yes?
Where the ropes are bolted outside, do they leave the bolts there for the next group that's coming along, or do you take that with you each time?
The bolts are usually permanently placed. The only times that bolts are not permanently placed are if you're climbing something and you don't want to leave them there, or if there's a rescue and you need extra rigging to help lift an injured person up a vertical space like that. Those are bolts that we can set and then take out and fill in the hole, essentially, to cover up that we had to do it.
So when it's a brand new cave that someone's been given permission to explore, how much do you know about what's down there before you actually try? I mean, do you need a 200-foot rope? Do you need a 400-foot rope?
So
It's
that
mind-boggling.
well, that's what keeps a lot of people doing this for so long is you know, but you don't know. You know the limits, I guess I should say. You know the theoretical limit of what could be there. If the water goes into the ground in one spot and then comes out somewhere else, you know most of the cave is going to be in between those 2 points. So you know kind of the physical limits, or if you know where there's no more limestone for the cave to form in, that's a physical limit. But everything in between those known limits is what we call white space, because on a map, it would just be blank white space on the paper, and it's just a big giant question mark. And you don't really know, and that's part of why people go and do this over and over and over again, because you don't actually know what's there. As far as a vertical space is concerned, rocks are great, and you can pick them up and throw them in, and it's really cool to hear them fall down and hit the floor. But it also gives you a little bit of an idea of how deep it is. But sometimes you don't know the pit's there. People have gone in and they've discovered very deep vertical spaces, and they have no ropes, and that's the end of their exploration for the day.
You come back with ropes.
And then you come back with ropes.
So you just throw the rock and count the time that it hits?
Yes.
Are there any Are there any dangerous animals that you have to worry about, or are there any things that you have to be careful about with your health when you're touching things?
Depends on where you're caving. I've never had a legitimate health problem from caving other than an injury of some kind. I've never gotten sick from something in a cave, but I do know people that have. I know people that have gotten histoplasmosis from bat droppings. I know people that have gotten, as an example of why we talk about conservation, I know people that have gotten sick because the stream that they're in, somebody else dumped fertilizer or manure, or there was a spill from an airport, and all that runoff went into the stream that they were in, and because they were up to their waist in it, that stuff got in their body, and it made them very sick. I do know of at least one person that had to go get a rabies shot because they were looking up at a ceiling and they had a bat pee in their eye.
Bears.
Yeah, bears. Bears do happen occasionally, but I don't know that I've ever. That's not as common as you'd think it is, actually.
Sarah Furnace when I was
Well, yeah, but other than that, usually if you're sick in a cave, it's because you came in sick.
Any other questions?
The flash bulbs, the ones with the magnesium wire in them, are they still made?
No. I buy up stock as I can find them. There is a company in Ireland that still makes them. They're very expensive for each bulb. They're used for really specialized types of high-speed photography usually. But mostly, for the longest time, I just trolled through eBay, and when I would find good deals for flash bulbs, I would buy them. I have a bunch of people that I know all over the country that would call me and say, hey, I was at the thrift store today and found a case. Do you want it? And they'll buy it and ship it to me. But recently, a photographer that I worked with for a very long time, he retired and got out of this. And he sold me his entire remaining inventory of 16,000 flash bulbs. So I actually don't know how to buy them anymore because I don't have to look to buy them anymore.
and people are still coming up saying, hey,
But people still give them to me, and I take them and add to the fire hazard in the house.
Anyone else?
I could probably come up with a dozen questions.
Okay, that's our presentation for tonight. And let's give a big round of applause to Ryan.
Glad you enjoyed it.
And join us this weekend for our field trip to the Fire Museum. And join us next week for our color and monochrome print contest for flowers.
What's
See
the
you.
Fire Museum?
Fire Museum is the 21st in the evening. Thank you. Have a
The lights are there only.
6 to 8 is when the lights are there. And have a good evening. Good night.